Martin Van Buren was a shrewd political operator and masterful strategist who became the 8th President of the United States. Martin Van Buren, the first president born as an American citizen, was born in Kinderhook, New York on December 5, 1782. He came from humble Dutch origins. He had a diminutive stature, standing only 5 feet 6 inches tall. Van Buren's family ran a tavern and farm. He was educated in local schools until the age of 14, when he began studying law. Then in 1803, at age 21, Van Buren was admitted to the New York bar and opened his own law practice in Kinderhook. Martin Van Buren was a self-made man who rose through sheer political skill. In 1807, Van Buren married his childhood sweetheart Hannah Hose. Hannah was also of Dutch descent from Kinderhook. They had 4 sons together before Hannah died of tuberculosis in 1819. Van Buren never remarried, and Hannah's death profoundly affected him throughout his life. Van Buren entered politics at a young age. He was appointed surrogate of Columbia County in 1808. He began to build a powerful political organization in New York. Van Buren understood that politics was about loyalty and patronage. He created what became known as the Albany Regency, a sophisticated political machine that controlled New York politics for decades. The Albany Regency was one of the first modern political machines in America. It rewarded supporters with government jobs and punished enemies by withholding patronage. In 1812, Van Buren was elected to the New York State Senate. He served in the state Senate while building his political base. Van Buren was a master of backroom dealing and coalition building. He knew how to count votes and how to deliver them when it mattered. During his time in the state Senate, Van Buren became a leader of the Bucktails, a faction of the Democratic-Republican Party in New York that opposed the political machine of DeWitt Clinton. Van Buren was a Jeffersonian Republican who believed in limited federal government and states' rights. He opposed the nationalist policies of the era. In 1821, Van Buren was elected to the United States Senate. As a senator, Van Buren quickly became one of the most influential politicians in Washington. He was known for his elegant dress and courtly manners. His opponents called him the Little Magician because of his political skills. They also called him the Red Fox of Kinderhook because of his red hair and cunning nature. In the Senate, Van Buren opposed the policies of President John Quincy Adams. Van Buren believed Adams represented the old Federalist elite. He worked to build a new political coalition that would bring together Northern workers, Southern planters, and Western farmers. Van Buren saw the need for a new national political party. He became one of the principal architects of the Democratic Party. Van Buren believed that political parties were essential to democracy. He thought parties organized public opinion and gave voters real choices. Van Buren formed an alliance with Andrew Jackson. He recognized that Jackson was immensely popular with ordinary Americans. Van Buren helped organize Jackson's presidential campaign in 1828. Van Buren's political machine in New York delivered crucial votes for Jackson. When Jackson won the presidency, Van Buren's influence grew enormously. In 1829, President Jackson appointed Van Buren as Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Van Buren became Jackson's most trusted advisor. He was part of Jackson's kitchen cabinet, an informal group of advisors who had more influence than the official cabinet. Van Buren skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of Jackson's administration. The administration was torn apart by the Petticoat Affair, a scandal involving the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton. Peggy Eaton was snubbed by the wives of other cabinet members who considered her morally questionable. Van Buren, as a widower, was not affected by the social controversy. He befriended Peggy Eaton and defended her in social situations. Van Buren's handling of the Petticoat Affair increased Jackson's trust in him. In 1831, Van Buren resigned as Secretary of State to help Jackson reorganize his cabinet. Jackson rewarded Van Buren by appointing him Minister to Great Britain. However, the Senate rejected Van Buren's appointment in a tie vote broken by Vice President John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, who had broken with Jackson, thought he was destroying Van Buren's political career. Instead, the rejection made Van Buren a martyr and increased his popularity. Jackson chose Van Buren as his running mate in 1832. Van Buren was elected vice president. As vice president, Van Buren continued to be Jackson's closest advisor. He supported Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson believed the bank was a corrupt institution that favored the wealthy elite over ordinary Americans. Van Buren agreed with Jackson's assessment. The bank war became the defining issue of Jackson's presidency. In 1836, Jackson handpicked Van Buren as his successor. Van Buren ran on Jackson's record and promised to continue Jackson's policies. Van Buren faced multiple opponents from the newly formed Whig Party. The Whigs ran different regional candidates hoping to deny Van Buren an electoral majority. But Van Buren's political organization proved too strong. He won the election with 170 electoral votes. Van Buren became the first president born after American independence. He was also the first president of Dutch rather than British ancestry. On March 4, 1837, Martin Van Buren was sworn in as the 8th President of the United States. Van Buren inherited a strong economy from Jackson. But within weeks of Van Buren's inauguration, the country plunged into economic crisis. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst financial crises in American history. Banks failed across the country. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. The panic was caused by several factors including speculation in Western lands, inflation, and the collapse of cotton prices. Van Buren's response to the panic was shaped by his political philosophy. He believed the government should not interfere in the economy. Van Buren thought the panic was caused by excessive speculation and easy credit. He believed the economy would correct itself naturally. Van Buren opposed government intervention to help struggling businesses or unemployed workers. This laissez-faire approach made Van Buren deeply unpopular. Americans suffering from the Depression blamed Van Buren for their hardships. Van Buren's major policy initiative was the creation of an independent treasury system. He proposed that the government keep its funds in its own vaults rather than in private banks. Van Buren argued this would prevent the government from contributing to speculation and economic instability. The independent treasury proposal was controversial. It took years of political fighting before Congress finally passed it in 1840. The independent treasury system represented Van Buren's commitment to separating government from banking. Van Buren faced other challenges during his presidency. Tensions with Great Britain flared over the border between Maine and Canada. The Aroostook War, as it was called, nearly led to armed conflict. Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott to negotiate a truce. The crisis was eventually resolved peacefully. Van Buren also faced controversy over Texas. Many Americans wanted to annex Texas, which had won independence from Mexico. But Van Buren opposed annexation because it would add another slave state and might provoke war with Mexico. Van Buren's position on slavery was complex and politically calculated. He was personally opposed to slavery but believed the federal government had no power to interfere with it in the states where it existed. Van Buren supported the gag rule in Congress that prevented discussion of anti-slavery petitions. He believed this was necessary to preserve the Union and keep the Democratic Party coalition together. Van Buren walked a careful line trying to maintain support from both Northern and Southern Democrats. The slavery issue became more heated during Van Buren's presidency. In 1839, enslaved Africans seized control of the Spanish ship Amistad off the coast of Cuba. The ship ended up in American waters and the Africans were imprisoned in Connecticut. Spain demanded their return. Abolitionists argued the Africans should be freed. Van Buren sided with Spain and wanted to return the Africans. But the courts ruled the Africans had been illegally enslaved and should be freed. The Amistad case highlighted the growing sectional tensions over slavery. Van Buren's presidency was marked by continued economic depression. The economy briefly recovered in 1838 but collapsed again in 1839. This second downturn was even worse than the first. Van Buren's popularity plummeted. His opponents called him Martin Van Ruin. They blamed him for the depression even though the causes were largely beyond his control. The Whigs portrayed Van Buren as an aristocrat who lived in luxury while ordinary Americans suffered. In the 1840 election, Van Buren faced Whig candidate William Henry Harrison. Harrison was a war hero who had fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Whigs ran a brilliant campaign. They portrayed Harrison as a man of the people who lived in a log cabin and drank hard cider. They depicted Van Buren as an effete dandy who drank champagne from gold cups. The log cabin campaign was one of the first modern political campaigns with rallies, songs, and slogans. The Whig slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referring to Harrison and his running mate John Tyler. Van Buren ran on his record, but the Depression made him vulnerable. He could not overcome the economic crisis. Harrison won in a landslide with 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. Van Buren carried only 7 states. It was a crushing defeat. On March 4, 1841, Van Buren left office and returned to his estate in Kinderhook called Lindenwold. He was only 58 years old and his political career seemed over. But Van Buren was not ready to retire from politics. He remained active in Democratic Party affairs. In 1844, Van Buren sought the Democratic nomination for president. He was the front-runner for the nomination. But Van Buren opposed the immediate annexation of Texas. His position cost him support from Southern Democrats. At the Democratic convention, Van Buren could not get the 2/3 majority needed for nomination. After multiple ballots, the convention nominated James K. Polk as a compromise candidate. Van Buren felt betrayed by the party he had helped create. Van Buren's views on slavery evolved after he left the presidency. He became increasingly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. In 1848, Van Buren made a surprising political comeback. He accepted the presidential nomination of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soilers opposed the extension of slavery into the Western Territories. Their slogan was Free Soil, Free Speech, Free Labor, and Free Men. Van Buren's decision to run as a Free Soiler split the Democratic Party in New York. Van Buren knew he could not win the presidency as a Free Soiler. But he wanted to make a statement about slavery. He believed the slave power, as he called it, had too much influence in the Democratic Party. Van Buren won no electoral votes in 1848, but he received over 291,000 popular votes, about 10% of the total. His candidacy helped Whig candidate Zachary Taylor defeat Democrat Lewis Cass. Van Buren's Free Soil campaign marked the beginning of the end for the second party system. After 1848, Van Buren retired from politics for good. He spent his final years at Lindenwold managing his estate. He traveled to Europe in 1853 and 1854. Van Buren remained interested in politics but did not seek office again. He watched with concern as the sectional crisis over slavery intensified. Van Buren feared the union he had worked to preserve was coming apart. He lived long enough to see the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Van Buren supported the Union cause during the Civil War. He endorsed the policies of President Abraham Lincoln. Van Buren believed preserving the Union was paramount. On July 24, 1862, Martin Van Buren died at Lindenwold at the age of 79. He died from asthma and heart failure. Van Buren was buried in Kinderhook Cemetery in his hometown. Martin Van Buren's legacy is complex and often overlooked. He was one of the most skilled politicians in American history. Van Buren helped create the modern two-party system. He understood that political parties could organize democracy and give structure to political debate. The Democratic Party that Van Buren helped build dominated American politics for decades. Van Buren pioneered many political techniques that are still used today, including party discipline, patronage, and machine politics. As president, Van Buren faced enormous challenges. The Panic of 1837 destroyed his presidency. His refusal to use government power to address the Depression reflected his political philosophy but made him unpopular. Van Buren believed in limited government and feared that government intervention would create more problems than it solved. His independent treasury system was an important reform that lasted for decades. Van Buren maintained peace with Great Britain and avoided war with Mexico. These were significant achievements even if they were overshadowed by the economic crisis. Van Buren's position on slavery was his greatest moral failure. He subordinated his personal opposition to slavery to political expediency. Van Buren believed that taking a strong stand against slavery would destroy the Democratic Party and the Union. He was willing to tolerate slavery where it existed to preserve national unity. Only after he left office did Van Buren take a principled stand against the expansion of slavery. His Free Soil campaign in 1848 showed that he was capable of putting principle above party loyalty, but it came too late to define his legacy. Van Buren was a transitional figure in American politics. He bridged the era of the Founding Fathers and the age of mass democracy. Van Buren was the first president born as an American citizen and the first from humble origins. He proved that someone without wealth or family connections could rise to the highest office through political skill and hard work. Van Buren was a professional politician at a time when that was not considered respectable. He made politics his career and showed that political organization was essential to democratic governance. Van Buren's personality shaped his political career. He was charming and sociable but also secretive and calculating. Van Buren rarely revealed his true thoughts. He was famous for being able to talk at length without committing to a position. His opponents mocked him as a political chameleon who changed his views to suit the moment. But Van Buren's caution and flexibility were also his strengths. He knew when to compromise and when to stand firm. Van Buren understood that politics was the art of the possible. Van Buren's contributions to American political development were significant. He helped establish the principle that political parties were legitimate and necessary institutions. Before Van Buren, many Americans viewed parties as dangerous factions. Van Buren argued that parties organized public opinion and made democracy work. He showed how parties could mobilize voters and hold politicians accountable. The party system that Van Buren helped create structured American politics for generations. Van Buren also pioneered the use of patronage to build party loyalty. The spoils system, as it was called, rewarded party supporters with government jobs. Van Buren believed this created a loyal party organization. Critics argued that patronage led to corruption and incompetence in government. Both views had merit. Patronage did build strong party organizations, but it also encouraged corruption. The spoils system dominated American politics until civil service reform in the late 19th century. Van Buren's presidency fell short of his abilities. He was a much better politician than president. Van Buren excelled at building coalitions and managing party affairs. But he struggled with the economic crisis that defined his presidency. Van Buren's rigid adherence to limited government principles prevented him from taking bold action to address the Depression. He lacked the vision and leadership to guide the nation through crisis. Van Buren was a political tactician rather than a statesman. Yet Van Buren deserves credit for maintaining democratic institutions during difficult times. He accepted his defeat in 1840 gracefully and left office peacefully. Van Buren respected the will of the voters even when they rejected him. He continued to participate in democratic politics after leaving the presidency. Van Buren's commitment to democracy and the rule of law was never in question. He believed in the American constitutional system even when it did not serve his interests. Van Buren's later opposition to the expansion of slavery showed moral growth. He recognized that the slave power threatened free labor and democratic institutions. Van Buren's Free Soil campaign helped lay the groundwork for the Republican Party. His willingness to break with the Democratic Party over slavery demonstrated courage. Van Buren sacrificed his position in the party he had built to take a stand on principle. This act of political courage partially redeemed his earlier compromises on slavery. Martin Van Buren was a pivotal figure in the development of American democracy. He transformed American politics by creating the first modern political party. Van Buren showed that democracy required organization and that parties could provide that organization. His political innovations shaped how Americans practiced democracy. Van Buren's career illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of democratic politics. He rose from obscurity to the presidency through talent and hard work. But he also showed how political calculation could lead to moral compromise. Van Buren remains one of the least remembered presidents. His presidency was overshadowed by the economic depression and sandwiched between the more memorable administrations of Andrew Jackson and the sectional crisis that led to civil war. But Van Buren's contributions to American political development were profound. He helped create the political system that Americans still use today. Van Buren was the little magician who made American democracy work through party organization and political skill. Even in historical obscurity, Van Buren's legacy endures in the institutions and practices he pioneered.